and we're going to share with you tonight a little bit about our new approach to feedback in school. Hopefully should be no more than half an hour, maybe a bit less. Jonathan is kindly manning the chat window. So if you have any questions as we go through that sort of come up and you feel like there may be something you want to sort of think that might be useful for everybody to think about, please do pop a question into the chat window and we'll try and make sure we've either covered them during it or we can come back to them at the end. We are going to record this session because we're aware that there are some parents, particularly who've got children over on ICNIL visits tonight. So we are going to record it and it will go onto the website after we've finished. Okay, so this is what we're going to do this evening. We're going to, could you move on, Mr. Gale, on to the next slide? Okay, no, that's fine. My able assistant.
Failed at the first hurdle.
Hopefully today, these are the things we're going to cover and give you a bit more of an insight in. So we're hoping to think about why we're trying something new. So we're going to talk to you about why we're doing this. Have a little discussion about the research behind it all. Go through our journey, so what we've been doing here to get to the point we're at now. We're going to think about what it looks like in the classroom. So what does it look like for the children on a day-to-day basis? Then we're going to think about why is it beneficial for your children and how you can support your child through some of the new mechanisms that we're bringing into place. And finally, a reminder that you are really, really welcome to come and have a look and see what we're doing. Okay, Jonathan, you're right to click on?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so firstly, it's a bit of an assumption to think that everybody knows what we mean when we talk about feedback. And if we think in terms of education and primary school learning, this is the sort of definition. So it's information given to the learner about the learner's performance relative, that means linked to their goals or outcomes. And it should aim to and be capable of producing improvements in students' learning. So feedback redirects or refocuses the learner's actions to achieve a goal by aligning effort and activity with an outcome. So we're really thinking about how it improves their learning, how it enables them to make progress and move on to their next steps. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So why do we need a new approach? Why do we think here at Watlington that this is needed? Well, it kind of links back really to all the work we've done on our curriculum over the last few years. So particularly, we've focused on thinking about how we can move our curriculum from being just based on what we call the national curriculum, which is what it's all the background for and where it sits. It's the heart of it. But on top of that, we really wanted to focus on the skills that the children need throughout their primary education. So our curriculum really has been adapted to that, really thinking about the skills throughout. And we've come up and use the Bloom's taxonomy, which I know Yvonne has spoken to you about, particularly when she did her COVID recovery presentation in the summer, so that we're really thinking about those skills they need. So thinking about understanding, remembering, applying, analysing, evaluating, and finally creating, so where the children really get to put it all into practice. And within that at school, through our curriculum, we've had curriculum action teams, and those are the staff. So that's all of us with our real skill sets being placed to look at the different subjects. So we've got the communication team, which focuses on lots of the English skills, understanding the world, so we're really thinking about history, geography, those sorts of topics, the STEM and the arts. And through those, we created a set of what we call skills ladders for each subject that run all the way from reception all the way up to year 6. And they look at the skills within each subject that the children need to reach those goals at the end of each year. So those skills ladders really help us as teachers for planning, assessment, and the next steps. And that's where it really comes back to feedback, because we need to ensure that those children understand those next steps in their learning. So we're going to look in a minute at some recent research within education and the evidence that really is pulling schools to think about what impact written feedback has. And there's a lot of research that says that it doesn't always result if a teacher writes in a book. So what that might look like is that might be some ticks, or it might be the same comment that you're writing in 20 books because everyone needs to work on the same thing. Or it might be just some really nice positive comments, but without any next steps. So those are all the sorts of things we think about when we think about traditional written feedback. When we were all younger, you'd have had, I don't know, marvelous handwriting, beautiful approach, or whatever it is. And it's really thinking about how actually research is saying that that doesn't actually necessarily impact on pupil outcomes or the progress, particularly linked to how much time and effort goes into writing in those books. So that's one thing. We'll look at some of that research in a second. The third thing is about active engagement. We really need to know that the children are actively engaged in their learning, and that means understanding their successes and understanding their next steps. We want them to be actively seeking ways to improve that. It's not a passive experience for them. They need to be actually part of that process. It's not being done to them. We've got to move away from that. And the final thing is that lots of the research is looking at is that feedback that is carried out after your teaching is done. So not during the lesson, but maybe that evening when teachers sit and mark a book or look at it, is much less effective than feedback given to children right when they're learning, right when they are thinking about their next steps or their misconceptions or their misunderstandings. So this is why we need to think about what we've been doing at school. Next slide, please. So what is the research and study? There is lots of research. It's a huge part of educational research at the moment. And here's sort of three of the sort of main things that have been looked at. So firstly, the Department of Education did a huge report into workload for teachers around marking. And three summaries that they came up with were that it needs to be meaningful, it needs to be manageable, and it needs to be motivating. So when we're giving feedback to children, those are the things we really need to think about. So meaningful, that means we need to be able to adjust how we give feedback based on age, group, subject. There isn't one size fits all. It must be manageable. So marking practice must be proportionate. So we've got to think about the cost effectiveness in terms of our outcomes and workload. You know, where is our time best spent? And the third one is that it needs to be motivating. So feedback really needs to motivate pupils to make progress, take responsibility, and make those next steps in a positive way. So one other piece of research that we've used a lot in school and we've looked at was carried out by the National College of Teaching and Leadership. So they do a lot of research-based projects within schools. And they did a project in some London schools during 2017, which really explored the impact of written marking on teacher workload and pupil outcome. And one of the key things they found, for example, was that teachers who spent on average 6.2 hours marking a week were actually having no more measurable difference in progress to those within the research project who were doing different forms of feedback. So actually that extra time they're spending after school marking books wasn't having the impact. Therefore, that real thought about the cost effectiveness, what could those teachers be doing with that time to ensure that children are really making progress? And the third really key bit of research that we've looked at is something by the Education Endowment Foundation, who do a lot of work on creating really useful, meaningful documents for schools to use and teachers to use. And one of their pieces of research really looked around how we need to, as teachers, think about the difference between when children make a really careless mistake and when they really don't understand something. So there's a misunderstanding. And we've got to think about how do we support children to correct careless mistakes which is something they can do with increasing independence, and how can we help them to move forward when there's a misunderstanding, which is really about their learning. So those were sort of three really important pieces of research that we used to support where we went to with this. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so, apologies, sorry, right. So this is our school journey. So this is kind of where we've come from and where we're going to. So that, the sort of the one on the left-hand side, which says curriculum development. So that's really where we started, which is what I explained before, that development of a skills-centered curriculum really linked to that language of learning. So those Bloom's language of remember, understand. So that's where we started with this, and all classes, and we'll have a look at some photos in a bit, have that sort of language of learning ladder. So we're thinking about that language all the time, and that's been in place since we made those developments to our curriculum. So the next part of our sort of thought process on this was, we were thinking, right, okay, so we've developed our curriculum in this way. How are we going to ensure that there's really a marked improvement in how children understand their learning, assess their learning, we assess their progress and make those next steps? So we undertook a bit of research. So part of that was doing a lot of reading, which was some of those highlights we've just shared with you. And also, really importantly, is visiting other schools, because actually that's where teachers do their best learning, is when they're talking to colleagues. We took a visit to a school in London called Charles Dickens Primary School, where they had lots of new approaches to feedback in place. In fact, they're one of the schools that took part in some of that research that I talked about previously. And they're a big, what we would call like a teaching school, so a school that has a lot of other teachers going in to learn, and they support other schools in those sort of new approaches. So that was one really important thing, to see it in action. The other thing that we then did is we're like, well, okay, so this is some ideas that we want to put into place. What's going on here? So some of the things we next needed to do was talk to the children. This is about their learning, and that was really important. So we undertook a whole series of children interviews. And actually, there were some overwhelming responses about their understanding of their work and their learning, and where do they get their feedback from. And at the time, so this was before we brought in a new approach, 80% of those children interviewed said that most of their feedback they get is written in their book, and they read it after they've done their work. That was the first thing that they thought of when we talked about feedback. But interestingly, 70% of those children in this group said actually the most useful bit of feedback they get from a teacher is when they talk to them and when they have that discussion, and they really understand their next steps better when it's verbal, when they have that talk. So this bit of children interview really started to shape that change we needed to make. So the next part of that was really about doing some trials in schools. So we had lots of teacher discussions about what sorts of feedback we could do, what other schools had used, what we'd like to trial. And we spent quite a long time, over a year, trialing different forms of feedback. Now, lots of those were things we already did, but doing them in a slightly different way. Some of them were new. So all of that went on, and all the teachers got a chance to trial all the different sorts of feedback that we were looking at. And on the back of that, we've put in place some new ways. Some of them will seem really familiar, but some of them will be new and are new to the children. And that led to our new policy, which you'll be soon able to see on the website. Okay, so on the sort of next step in that bit at the bottom is that ongoing staff and pupil training. So the training is really important, because if we're bringing in new strategies to use in our teaching, we need to make sure the pupils are really well trained and versed in how it's going to impact them and how they can be part of that process. So this is really the cycle, because obviously that's going to bring us back to continuing to look at the curriculum, how those skills link in, and so it goes on. And hopefully it's an ongoing process for the future as well. Okay, next slide. So what does it look like? So you're probably thinking, well, how's it going to look different for my child? Well, the first most important thing is that there is lots and lots and lots of modelled language of learning. So what we mean by that is coming back to some of those, that Bloom's taxonomy, that language of how are the skills really being used in the classroom. So that's everywhere. Every class you go into is really thinking about, what does the word understand mean? What does it look like in my lesson? What does it look like in my English lesson, my maths lesson, my history lesson? Why do I need that skill? So lots of that. The next thing that you would see is lots of what we call live marking. And that's where the teachers are marking within the lesson. So we're not waiting till after school when we got a pile of books, but we're actually doing it there and then. That might be marking within their book. It might be marking with a big group, a small group, one child, the whole class, so that they're marking as we go. So children are really seeing immediately how well they're getting on with the task and the objectives. So the next thing you'll see is lots of use of self-assessment. So we're training and teaching those children to become good at recognizing their own successes. Are they really clear? Can they spot in their work, oh yeah, look, we're working today on how to add in adjectives, and oh look, I'm able to spot what I'm doing, or that sentence hasn't got it in it. So lots of use of self-assessment using that language of skills. And we use this, our purple pen time, and your children might already talk about it at home, and that's where they can go back and they're marking their own work, they're making comments on their own work, they're thinking about what next steps they need. And so that's a really important part of the process. The next thing you'd see a lot of is what we call peer assessment. And that's where children work together with someone else and look at each other's work. And that's a really valuable process, because actually, one, you can learn lots from what someone else is doing. And it also makes you really look at a piece of work more objectively, and really teaching them how you can do that in a positive way. And we're using something called peer prompts, so ways of supporting children to do that, that really thinks about next steps and progress. We'll show you some examples in a minute. Another thing we're doing lots of is something called our red, yellow and green trays. So these are trays in the classroom that we use where the children can assess how well they feel they have managed the tasks. And if they're feeling like, yes, I've really confidently got through this, I'm feeling like I've really understood it, they might put their book in the green tray at the end of the lesson. If they're feeling like, oh yeah, maybe I needed a little bit of support, but then I had a really good go on my own, they might put it in the yellow. And the red tray might be like, do you know what, I could really do with a bit more support with this. So those are being used and can be used for different reasons. So teachers can think about different ways of using those. And it gives that really clear picture of how the children understand how well they've succeeded. So the whole class and group feedback sessions is the next thing. And this is something that we've always done a lot of in school, and you'd find in all schools, but this is now becoming really pertinent and a really important session when the feedback that we're giving is really specific to what the learning is setting out to do. So actually it might be picking up 20 minutes into the lesson that there's something that everyone's misunderstood, right? We're stopping, we're coming back together, we're having another session altogether. Or it might be saying, okay, I've picked out these 4 or 5 children who need something, I'm going to do a specific session on feedback for them so that they've got a really sort of honed bit of information about their own learning. The passports of learning. So we started those in the summer and they came back with the children in the summer. And that was sort of on the back of our sort of COVID recovery program, really. But actually we felt that there was a huge benefit to that going forward. So actually we are going to be involving those passports throughout the year. So we'll be coming back to those skills that they need in terms of each year group and assessing the children against those. And the last one is thinking about the records that teachers keep. So obviously, you know, you're thinking, well, if you're not writing on their books, how are you keeping a record of assessment? So we've developed some specific formats for doing that as well. Okay, so if we just move on. So this is that language progression I was talking about. So we were saying that there's lots of modeled language. Now this is very, very small. It is on the website, I think. Jonathan, I'm not sure. Under
so.
the curriculum area, I think it is. Yeah, I think it's there. And basically it shows a list of language within each of those elements that we were talking about that we try and introduce to the children in each year group. And those are the words that we're really trying to build on year, so that they're developing a huge set of vocabulary to understand their own learning. Okay, next one. So this is just some examples, really. So this is what we would call a toolkit, and you might hear your children talking about a toolkit, and that really is the things that they need to include in their work. So this is a piece of writing. So the features at the top, they're the things that we're looking at. This is an example of some self-assessment where a child has used actually colour pens to look at their work, find examples in their work, and then assess their work against those. And they've also thought about the next step. So the next part of this would then be the teacher going in and then putting their assessment against that. Okay, the next one. Another example of this. So this is in a bit more detail, really thinking about things that they really need to have in their work. What makes them a good story? What grammar things do they need? Their own self-assessment, the teacher assessment, and then really thinking about those next steps. So some of these might be ticks, they might be writing about their own. So that purple pen use you can see coming in. Thinking about why have they rated themselves in a certain way? What have they done? What have they done to succeed? Or what do they think they've achieved and why? So this is our record form, one of the record forms we might use in the class at the end of a lesson, where we're looking at their books, looking at how they've judged themselves, really looking at the objectives. Okay, which children, what are there things that we have to go back to the whole class with? Are there things for individuals or groups? So it's one of our sort of mechanisms for assessment. And this is what you'll see in the classroom. So you'll see this language ladders that we've got there on the left, so the remembering, and we use those little arrows to think about, well, where are we today? Where are we working at today? Are we remembering something? Are we pulling it from our long-term memory into our working memory and we're now understanding it? Are we going to do something with this now? So where are we at? Okay, the next one. And lots of displays in the school are really talking about those skills and how we apply it in our learning. So it's becoming a real thread throughout the classrooms. Okay, this is one of our peer prompts and self-assessment prompts, so little cards that the children can have in front of them. Think about the language they're using when they're assessing their own work. Okay, so finally, really, we're going to think, well, why is this beneficial for your child? What are they going to get out of this? So what it's going to mean for them is that they can become really clear about their successes. They can be really able to spot what they've done well. They're going to be able to think about what progress they've made and know where they need to go next. They're going to get that in immediate response as well. They're not waiting for that until the next lesson when it's kind of gone to the back of their mind. They're getting that immediately, so they're really ready to take that next step. They're going to be developing excellent vocabulary for understanding their own learning and expressing what they do know and where they need to go. And it's really clear, that vocabulary. It's really linked to the skills development, and it's used in the learning objectives the teachers do, the feedback they give, their self-assessment. We're using the same language. It's really meaningful, and it's when they're learning, not the next day or the next 2 days. They've developed great mechanisms for peer talk and evaluation. And now, because we're doing that feedback within the school day, teachers are really able to spend good quality time adapting, planning and teaching so that those next steps are really at the forefront of where we need to go with our lessons. And that it's a process. This isn't an end point. There isn't an end point to this, that it's just a process, and that the children and teachers alike are looking at that process. Okay, so really, well, what can you do in this whole sort of system, I guess? We'll use those home learning activities you get as a time to ask your child to think about the skills they're using. So what skills are they applying? You know, are they remembering something? Are they understanding? What skills are they using? Try and think, and this is a hard one, but really try and think about praising the effort and attitude to the task rather than the outcome. You know, that whole lovely phrase you get all the time on Strictly Come Dancing, everything, it's the journey we're going on. Well, what is the journey that they've taken in that piece of work? Okay, how have they got there? You know, it's not just about a beautiful piece of work at the end, but what have they learned along the way? And really encourage your child to start looking for those careless mistakes, you know, and those careless mistakes, for example, in writing might be the full stops and capital letters, for example, or it might be in maths where they've just not lined up their numbers correctly when they're doing some addition, or they've put the wrong symbol. Or so really thinking, you know, oh gosh, is that something you don't understand? Or is that, oh yeah, look, I just forgot that. And they probably love to get the purple pen on it as well. That's what they'll go to. And really just focus on thinking about the skills that they've learned rather than what they've done in the day. You know, what skills were you using? So hopefully that's going to help you just a little bit to think about how you can support the process. So this is over to Gemma now, actually, because this is just a little bit of how this links into the EYFS.
Thanks, Ree. I'm not on mute, am I? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So really everything that Ree's talked about feeds into our early years approach. So but our attitude to learning, we call it the characteristics of effective learning, and it's split up into three areas. So and this starts right from nursery, goes into reception, and then lots of elements of this we use in Key Stage 1 as well. So playing and exploring. So just sort of to build on that bit, to explain it to you, it's about the children being engaged, having a go, which sounds really basic, but actually when you're 3 and 4, it's something that they really need to work on, about building resilience and about just increasing their independence. The active learning is about concentrating more over time. It's about being a bit more goal directed, so knowing that there's something at the end, but then it links really nicely to what Ree is saying. It's also about children really valuing the process, so not necessarily just about the end outcome, but actually knowing that there is something, but that process is really important to get there. It's about building a range of strategies really to sort of try and reach that goal, and then giving them the toolkits to sort of pull on the strategies that they need. And at that point it could be as simple as they want to make a card. Do they know where they need to go to get something? Do they know that they want to use paint for it? How would they go about getting that? Which sounds really basic, but this is sort of the, you know, the foundations before the rest sort of carries on. Really is about encouraging children to you know, to have a go through trial and error. Okay, I didn't get it this time, I'm going to have another go in a different way. And then creating and thinking critically is really about thinking, okay, I've made this, can I go back? Can I change it? And at a really early age, in fact, Ree, you'll probably say, going right through, children find it really hard. They'll say, I've done it. And actually, we're really encouraging those children to use the Bloom's language to think, I'm going to modify this and I'm going to evaluate it. And actually, could it be a little bit better? And am I going to give some extra time to really change it? Not to say that it's a bad thing, but actually it's really good to modify things to make it better. And you know, at a basic reception level, it could be something to do with block play. They build a tower, or they're building something, it hasn't worked quite right, so they're going to adapt it and modify it a little bit. Also just feeling confident with their own ideas, so thinking it's okay actually if I want to have my own idea, and I'm going to have a little go and then I'm going to change it and modify it. And again, it goes back to this concentrating over time, which then again links with the Blooms, the remembering, the memorizing. So it all sort of feeds in really, and what that might look like or what it might sound like in a classroom, we try and link to something called the achiever source. So some of you have had the your children recently go through foundation stage would hopefully know about these, that we would use the dinosaurs to kind of link in the blooms. So we would say, okay, you're a Triceratops, you've really tried your hardest, or you're a Stichosaurus, you're really sticking at this today, well done, or you're an Ascaraptor, you're really asking lots of questions. And we use that, we build on that from reception, then we actually still use those in Key Stage 1, because we find it's a really nice way and a bit more of an exciting way to support the children with the Bloom's language and their attitudes and skills. And then really everything that Rhys said, you know, we use in the classrooms, even reception and in nursery, but it might just look slightly different. We make sure that it's age appropriate. And the next steps are really important in early years, because it has to be immediate and it has to be in the now. So, you know, okay, you might not know this colour, when that might come up when they're playing cards. Right, come on then, let's go and find as many blue things as we can find, or red things, and that would look really different in a year 6 class. But it's all goes back to that learning in the skills. Okay, we've identified that there's a need and we're going to action that, so which hopefully ties up the cycle. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour into our early years.
Thank you, Gemma. Yeah, and actually I think one thing to say on the back of that is lots of this sort of practice, when we've sort of researched, we're like, well, actually lots of these are things that the early years have been very effective at for a long time, and actually we've drawn quite a lot and learned quite a lot from that experience in how children respond to immediate feedback. So it's definitely been a sort of a corner part of it, and how that sort of fed into the rest of the school. Okay, so finally, really, the most important thing to finish with is we'd like you to come and have a look. And when we have our open afternoons on that first week back after the half-term break, and you're coming in to see your children, one of the things we'd like you to do is have a little look, you know, in their books, see what it's looking like in their books, have a look at how that looks in the classroom, talk to the teacher about what feedback is like. We'd like that to be a process that you're really part of. This isn't something that's just being done here. We want to be sharing it with you, and for you to be part of that. So please come in on that afternoon and let us share that with you. I think that's it really for this now. Jonathan, was there anything that came up that needs addressing?
Just a huge thank you, Rhiannon, for all the hard work that you've put in over the last couple of years. Really, it's been a really exciting project, and I know all the team are really enthused with it, and they can already see the impact it's having across the school and all the children's learning and progress. And I think it'll just go from strength to strength. I have got one other thing which is slightly disconnected from this, but I'm just taking the opportunity while I've got a few parents listening. We do have a parent governor vacancy at the moment, so if any of you are interested, please come and speak to any one of us if you want a bit more information, or even come to the office and ask for Sarah Wood, our chair of governors, contact details, and she would happily speak to you as well. But if any of you are keen after what you've heard this evening and think that you might want to come and offer your services on a whole school level, it'd be really appreciated. I think we've got a couple of weeks before the deadline, so you've got enough time if you want to do a bit of exploring around that. But thank you all very much for coming. Thanks again to Rhi and Gemma for all of your work, and hopefully see you tomorrow bright and early at the gates.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.